May the 5th, 2025, an IED exploded, ripping a military vehicle to shreds. 2 members of Cameroon's elite rapid intervention battalion were killed and 3 others were critically injured. May the 10th, suspected separatist figures killed a civilian in Bamenda for drinking a beer popular among the country's francophone population. May 15th, government forces conducted an operation in Pinion, a village in the northwest, killing 6 civilians, among them a man with documented mental health issues. If you've not heard about any of these incidents, we can't blame you. A fire has quietly been burning through the Central African nation of Cameroon, and the world has, for all intents and purposes, closed its eyes, put 2 fingers in its ears, and nothing's happening. Cause of that fire is a war in the country's English-speaking regions, a war known as the Anglophone crisis. An armed conflict between separatist groups demanding independence and the central government in Yaoundé, the crisis began as peaceful civil society protests before spiraling into full-blown insurgency. One marked by assassinations, kidnappings, military raids, mass displacement, and systemic human rights abuses on both sides. Thousands are dead, entire villages are empty, schools, hospitals, and homes have been burned to the ground. Separatists call it a liberation war, but in the government's eyes, it's a simple counter-terrorism operation. Caught in between are over 5 million people, most of them English-speaking, many of them now displaced, grieving, or simply trying to survive a conflict they did not choose. Imagine, if you will, what happens when you take 100 litres of petrol, dump it on top of a dry haystack, and light a match. That's more or less what happened in Cameroon in 2016. It began with black gowns and chalkboards. In October 2016, lawyers dressed in black robes and white wigs reminiscent of their British counterparts took to the streets across Bamenda, the capital of Cameroon's northwest region. Their protest was simple. Francophone judges who neither spoke English nor understood the common law system practiced in the Anglophone regions were being parachuted into English-speaking courts. It was, in their view, a continued attempt by Yaoundé to erode the Anglophone legal system. Teachers were not far behind. They walked out of classrooms furious that Francophone educators, many unable to teach in English, were flooding Anglophone schools. If left unchallenged, the future of Cameroon's Anglophone culture could be rewritten in a language that wasn't theirs. At first, the protests were peaceful. The government's reaction, though, was anything but. Security forces cracked down on demonstrators. Rubber bullets became live ammunition. Protesters were arrested, tear-gassed, and in some cases shot. According to Frederick Takang from the BBC, at least 1 person was shot dead on the first day of the protests, while 10 others were admitted to the hospital, with 4 in critical condition. 2 weeks into the protests, more than 100 people have been arrested. In December, police opened fire on demonstrators in Bamenda, killing at least 4 people. By the start of 2017, the situation had become untenable, and Paul Biya, Cameroon's president since 1982, addressed it in his New Year's message to the country, calling for dialogue. The government created an ad hoc committee to find common ground with members of the Cameroon Anglophone Civil Society Consortium, or CACSC, an organisation of English-speaking lawyer and teacher trade unions that were in the forefront of the protests. The dialogue was, in a word, unsuccessful. CACSC members demanded that the government release everyone who had been arrested before any dialogue could proceed. The government responded by arresting even more people. Eventually, the CACSC presented Yaoundé with a plan for federalism that the government outright rejected. And on January 17, 2017, the government, through a ministerial decree, banned the CACSC and the Southern Cameroon's National Council, or SCNC, a political organisation seeking the independence of Anglophone Cameroon. Apart from banning the organisations, Yaoundé also declared that their activities were against the security and unity of Cameroon. Eugene Nfongwa, co-founder and executive editor of the Standard Tribune, believed that the government's decision signalled a readiness to enter a more repressive phase in dealing with Anglophone activists. Furthermore, it would provide a legal basis for controversial decisions such as the mass arrest of protesters. Then came the blackout. On the same day that the government banned CACSC and SCNC, it also muzzled the internet across the Anglophone regions. It was a devastating blow, particularly for the city of Buea, the southeast's capital and heart of Cameroon's digital economy. Internet Sans Frontières, an organisation that defends digital rights and freedoms, estimated that in the first 2 weeks, the internet shutdown cost businesses up to $723,000. While that sum might seem a bit paltry, we do need to consider it in the context of Cameroon, where over 10 million people, or a third of the total population, live on less than $1.80 a day. Apart from crippling the Southwest's economy, the blackout made it nearly impossible to organize resistance. Access to the internet was restored 3 months later, but something had shifted. People who had been calling for reforms began whispering about revolution, a revolution that would soon blow up into today's blood-soaked crisis. But before we listen to those whispers, we first need to take a moment to listen to the echoes of the past, because that is where the seeds of this crisis were planted.
Just before we continue today, try a fun experiment with me. Google yourself, pop in your name. If you're Joe Blogs or John Smith or whatever, maybe put your city, maybe put a job, maybe put the first line of your address and see what comes up. And the odds are you'll probably find there's some weird website out there with too much personal information about you to be comfortable. There's white pages, business registries, legal databases. You didn't put it there, but there it is. It's not very nice. But today's sponsor, Incogni, will help it get taken down. They send automated removal requests to over 250 data brokers. But now they have something called the Unlimited plan, which can go even further. If you found your info on a random site, just paste that link into your Incogni dashboard and their privacy experts will try to remove it, even if it's not one of their usual targets. There are limits, social media, court records, they're off the table. But for everything else, it's a serious privacy upgrade. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use the code WarFronts at incogni.com/warfronts and you'll get 60% off an annual plan. And now back to today's episode.
If you watched our recent deep dive into the crisis in the DRC, some of what you're about to hear will sound rather familiar. Because, like the Congo, Cameroon's current nightmare was not born in the 2010s. It didn't even start in the 20th century. It began when European leaders with no understanding of the region's complex societies gathered around a table in Berlin in 1884 and carved up Africa like a roast. Germany claimed Cameroon, adding it to the broader German Empire, but their rule wouldn't last very long. Shortly after the start of the First World War, the British invaded Cameroon from Nigeria and the French from French Equatorial Africa. The last German fort in the country surrendered in 1916, ending 3 decades of German rule. After the Allied victory in the war, the territory was partitioned between the United Kingdom and France. The French took the lion's share, about 4/5 of Cameroon's land, while London took 2 slivers along Nigeria's eastern border, christened Northern and Southern Cameroon. This fracture line still defines Cameroon's conflict to this day. The French administered their territory as part of the broader French Equatorial Africa, imposing French language, laws, and centralized governance from the top down. The schools were taught in French, the courts were in French, church was in French. In short, everything that mattered was as French as a baguette made of insufferable bureaucracy. The British, on the other hand, governed their parts of Cameroon as appendages of Nigeria. The northern and southern Cameroons were ruled directly, with local chiefs acting as intermediaries under British colonial administrators. English became the official language of instruction, and a common law system based on the British legal system was adopted. For 40 years, 2 different legal systems, languages, and political trajectories unfolded across one divided land. The two were destined to collide, and in 1960 the inevitable happened. The French portion of Cameroon gained sovereignty under President Amadou Ahidjo. With one half of the country independent, all eyes turned to British Cameroon. What to do about those slivers of land under British control? Well, the lads at the UN had an idea. Nigeria was also scheduled to gain independence in 1960, so why not offer the people in British Cameroon the option of voting for their future? The vote, however, was not a choice between independence or union. It was a forced binary: Nigeria or Cameroon. Autonomy wasn't even on the ballot. The Muslim-majority North opted for union with Nigeria, while the South, the territory that includes today's Northwest and Southwest regions, voted to join Cameroon. So in October 1961, English-speaking Southern Cameroon joined the French-speaking Republic of Cameroon under a federal arrangement. The 2 territories would supposedly be equal partners in a bilingual federation, like Quebec and the rest of Canada. As an equal partner, Southern Cameroon was promised autonomy over its legal, educational, and administrative systems. But given that the country is now featured on WarFronts, you can probably guess that this promise was soon going to be broken. In the years that followed, the federal structure was quietly eroded. Power was consolidated in Yaoundé, the Francophone capital. Anglophone leaders were sidelined. And by 1972, the federation was formally abolished through a national referendum. The new state was called the United Republic of Cameroon. Yaoundé hailed the referendum as unification, but in the Anglophone regions, they could think of a more appropriate name: annexation. What followed was a steady tightening of central control. English-speaking Cameroonians began to see a pattern. Their schools were being assimilated into the Francophone system. Courts increasingly relied on civil law, eroding the common law framework. Government appointments overwhelmingly favored Francophones. The English-speaking identity, forged under a colonial regime but deeply internalized by the locals, was gradually pushed to the margins. Yet despite these warning signs, there was no civil war, no insurgency, no call to arms. At least not yet. But a seed had been planted, a promise made and broken, a union formed and hollowed out. That seed, watered by decades of marginalization, would eventually bloom into the crisis that we're seeing today. In 1984, Cameroonian attorney and political activist Von Fongum Gorgie Dinka coined the word Ambazonia to refer to the Anglophone regions of Cameroon as part of a campaign for the restoration of the region's autonomy. In the years since, Ambazonia has become a rallying cry for independence-seeking Anglophones and inspired multiple groups that would come to define the course of the Anglophone crisis. First, the Ambazonia Governing Council, which was formed in 2013 after the merger of several pro-independence groups. According to the International Crisis Group, the AGC is one of the most hardline separatist groups. The hardline descriptor is well-earned because they were among the first pro-independence groups to advocate for violent resistance. On September 9th, 2017, almost a year after the October 2016 protests that set the region ablaze, they declared a war of independence and created an armed wing known as the Ambazonian Defense Forces, or ADF. Their weapons were crude, hunting rifles, machetes, and makeshift explosives, but their determination was unmatched. They launched ambushes, set up roadblocks, conducted hit-and-run raids. Civilians were sometimes caught in the crossfire. Sometimes they were targeted directly. Forced recruitment became common. So did retribution killings. Villagers lived in fear of both the military and the rebels. One wrong move, one wrong word, and you were branded either a terrorist or a traitor. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the Southern Cameroon's Ambazonia Consortium United Front, SCACUF, a non-violent independence movement that unilaterally declared Ambazonia's independence on October 1st, 2017. The date was symbolic, as it marked the 56th anniversary of the unification of Cameroon and Southern Cameroons. SCACUF would morph into the Interim Government of Ambazonia, or IG, and continue to reject armed resistance in favor of diplomatic campaigns and civil disobedience. That would eventually change in the face of unrelenting pressures from Yaoundé. Speaking of Yaoundé, the government sent in the army to fight the separatists and quell the rebellion. The declaration of Ambazonian independence hadn't just given the movement a name, it gave it something even more powerful. It gave it a flag to die for. By 2018, the conflict had spread like wildfire. Dozens of militias emerged, each with its own turf, its own agenda, and its own bloodlust. Some were nationalists, others were warlords. A few were criminals masquerading as liberators. IEDs started appearing on roads, soldiers were killed in ambushes, civilians were kidnapped, held for ransom, or tried by kangaroo courts and then executed. In response, the government launched brutal counteroffensives, killing separatists and their supporters. However, Yaoundé's greatest success that year did not happen on the battlefield or even within its own borders. It actually happens in Nigeria. The Nigerian government arrested 69 separatists, including Sisiku Julius Tabe, chairperson of SCACUF and Ambazonia's first president. They would spend 10 months at a gendarme headquarters before being transferred to a maximum security prison and eventually sentenced to life in prison. These arrests didn't stop the separatists. If anything, they seemed to have emboldened them. On May the 20th, aiming to disrupt celebrations of Cameroon's National Day, the separatists attacked several villages, kidnapping the mayor of Bangjem. The fighting continued unabated into 2019, and while we won't discuss every individual skirmish, the violence had by then become so widespread that the international community could bury its head in the sand no longer. On May the 5th, following appeals by the European Union Parliament, it was announced that the Anglophone crisis would be debated at the UN Security Council. The original proposal was for a formal debate. However, due to objections from South Africa, at the time a non-permanent council member, they would only have informal talks. South Africa and other African countries opposed the involvement of the UN in the Anglophone crisis, preferring that the African Union handle it instead. While a noble goal, the African Union has proven itself wholly incapable of resolving both this and other crises on the continent, from Sudan's ongoing implosion to the on and off war between Congo and rebels backed by Rwanda. Kukathatso B. Shah and other researchers writing in the Journal of African Union Studies highlighted several reasons for the Union's failure over the Anglophone crisis, including an unwillingness to interfere in what they initially viewed as the internal affairs of a sovereign nation. The researchers argued that the AU's indifference to the conflict contributed to its escalation. Even when the AU did intervene, there was little political will to actually solve the conflict. The researchers specifically spotlighted the AU's Peace and Security Council, saying, and we'll quote here, "The body does not have the political will to intervene. Its stance is largely rhetorical when it can use sanctions to force both parties to the discussion table." Despite these failures, the international pressure did yield some results, though they proved more cosmetic rather than substantive. On May the 9th, Cameroonian Prime Minister Joseph Ngute, while on a trip to the Anglophone regions, announced that President Paul Biya was ready for an inclusive dialogue to end the war. The catch? Ambazonian independence? That was off the table. Obviously, this was a non-starter for the separatists, and a week after this announcement, they killed at least 2 government soldiers in Bamenda. Cameroonian soldiers responded with a crackdown, burning several houses, a church, and a health center in the process. As the year wore on, however, the separatists engaged in informal talks with the government, culminating in President Biya's announcement that the government would hold a major national dialogue with the separatists. He stressed that the dialogue would be within the context of the constitution, signaling again that there would be zero discussion on Ambazonian independence. Although the dialogue didn't stop the violence, it provided some concessions for the Anglophone regions. In December 2019, the Cameroonian National Assembly passed legislation granting special status to the northwest and southwest regions. They would get more control over some of the contentious issues that had started this conflict, like education and cultural development. The reactions were mixed, to say the least. While the government celebrated and the separatists dismissed the concessions, the average Anglophone Cameroonian was just confused. Dr. Nick Nguyen, an Anglophone politician, summed it up best. Speaking to DW, he said, quote, "When we were told that we would have a special status, everybody was confused. It was something we were not really looking at. In terms of terminology, we had to find out what it meant. It was like an empty container, and everybody was waiting for the meaning to fill it. And when that meaning came, I, for one, realized it would not solve our problems." End quote. Realizing that this wouldn't be enough to end the conflict, the government followed this anemic carrot up with the stick of a ramped-up military offensive and began recruiting vigilante groups to fight the separatists in a scene that is once again oddly reminiscent of the DRC. By 2022, the conflict had hardened into a stalemate, with each side dealing with internal issues while struggling to find a path to victory. The separatists, rocked by infighting and a leadership crisis, had long since abandoned the idealism of the initial protests and the unity of shared struggle. They looked less like a liberation front and more like a patchwork of fractured militias, each operating like a government in exile, yet barely governing their own checkpoints. Despite this, they still enjoyed significant public support. The Washington Post noted that the government's use of force was driving a not insignificant number of moderate Cameroonians to throw their support behind the armed separatists. Conversely, the government was facing the reality of fighting an asymmetric war against an intransient insurgency. Decades of marginalization had made Yaoundé unpopular in the Anglophone region, and as many governments can tell you, it is nearly impossible to root out an insurgency that enjoys public support. Add to this the fact that Yaoundé is also fighting the Islamic State West African province in the country's north, and it's no wonder that the government is struggling. In 2025, while providing an update on the Cameroonian crisis, Africa Continental wrote that the Anglophone crisis had remained a bloody stalemate, with neither the government nor the rebels in a position to win the conflict. So, where does that leave Cameroon? The Anglophone crisis has left an indelible mark on Cameroon. You see it in the empty schoolyards, in the bullet holes carved into health clinics, in the haunted eyes of a child who hasn't known a day of peace in years. Human Rights Watch estimates that at least 6,000 civilians have been killed by both government forces and armed separatist fighters since the fighting started. 598,000 people are internally displaced, at least 2 million need humanitarian aid, and more than 100,000 have fled across the border to Nigeria. However, this reality only exists for those west of the Congo River. For those on the river's east, in Douala and Yaoundé, life goes on. Coffee shops serve French pastries. The national football team makes headlines. Children go to school. In an ideal world, this is the point in the story where we'd cue the heroic music as we told you about the peace and the rebuilding process. However, in Cameroon, hope has been weaponized and worn down. The thing with stalemates is that unless something drastic happens, both sides usually content to let the status quo play out. Unfortunately, the status quo means more death and devastation. The international community also seems to have got caught up in this stalemate. From 2019 to 2022, the Swiss government tried to mediate and end the conflict, but the process collapsed when Yaoundé pulled out. In 2023, the Canadian government announced it would hold peace talks between the belligerents to achieve a comprehensive, peaceful, and political resolution to the crisis. Unfortunately, Yaoundé once again doused the flames of hope with a cold bucket of liquid disappointment, claiming in a statement that it had, quote, not entrusted any foreign country or external entity with the role of mediator or facilitator to settle the crisis. If the belligerents are unwilling to end this conflict, and the international community seems powerless to do so, we're then forced to ask, where does that leave Cameroon? According to Akeleke Christian Leke, a Cameroonian peace-building and development expert, the answer might come from its youth. Writing for Peace Lab, he highlights how Cameroonian youth, who make up more than 60% of the population, have taken the lead in peace-building initiatives. One group, Local Youth Corner Cameroon, provides a safe space for dialogue among young people to engage them in the peace process and mobilizes them into networks to coordinate and channel youth efforts effectively. Cameroonian youth are also working with conflict victims, supporting their recovery and social reintegration. Other organizations like Defy Hate Now are building media and information literacy, sensitizing their peers to combat hate speech and misinformation. It is a thankless job that puts their lives at risk. Quoting from Peace Lab, many young peace builders are accused of being traitors, arrested, kidnapped, or even killed by the separatist armed groups, with little to no attention given to the victims. They lack societal recognition, financial and technical support, and protection by the national government. Despite these risks, they continue to pursue peace. They continue to believe that tomorrow can be better and that it's worth fighting for. Not with guns, not with grenades or rocket launchers, but with the peace builders' arsenal. Dialogue, mediation, and more dialogue. And they do this because, as unfashionable as it may seem to say right now, peace is always worth it. Thank you for watching.